All right, welcome to another edition of the Seth and Gentry Show, or the Gentry and Seth Show. This is Gentry Estes with Dogs247.com and the now nationwide, worldwide, universe-wide 24/7 Sports Network. And I work for a newspaper, Macon Telegraph. Gentry, let's talk about the Kentucky game. Not really quick, because in my mind this obviously has a lot that's instructive going into the Florida game, and in some ways, in a lot of ways, backs up the concerns that we saw from the South Carolina game. Defense principally, which we'll talk a lot about today, and what the hell is going on there. Special teams, a little bit with the run game. Gentry, first off, you were doing your film study, and you had this on your website, and you were, I guess, talk a little bit about the running game for Georgia and what you think's going on there.
Well, it's hard to really look at it and see why they can't stop the run this year when that was such a big part of that defense last year. And I think Kentucky had a good plan. I think they used Georgia's speed against them. They ran a lot of little counters and delayed draws to try to kind of suck guys in, rushing on the edges and then getting past them. And when Georgia would blitz off the edges, it would almost make it worse. You would sometimes have 3 or 4 guys who would be behind the football after a second or two. Then you're outnumbered ahead of the football. And Kentucky would then have numbers on the offensive line against the few down linemen or inside linebackers in there. They were able to get gaps and exploit it and run the ball. Now,
so
why that didn't happen last year?
It's not as simple as Avery Jones isn't there and Jarvis Jones isn't there and Jenkins as an end together with Geathers isn't.
I think Avery Jones obviously would help. I think Jarvis Jones would help, but I think it was more schematic than it was them getting overpowered in this game. South Carolina was a little different. I think this game was Kentucky had a good plan and they executed real well, and they blocked them up front. Georgia, they did stop the run some, but it was you kind of set the tone early with Kentucky taking the ball and running it right down the field and getting a touchdown out of it. And I think what happens is when you get exploited, as they have in a couple of games, you're showing other teams how to do it. And I think that the fact that a few teams early were able to run on Georgia, they've continued to show other teams ways that you can use Georgia's speed against them, and I think that's what.
Well, before we get to the offense, let's stick with the defense going into this Florida game, because I would say that's still the number one thing for this team, and it's flabbergasting in retrospect that it's been this way. The simple, if you're looking for a simple solution to this, is that when you had the suspensions at the beginning of the year and you've had Jarvis miss a couple games, that there's been cohesion, guys going in and out. But the counter argument that players will give you is that they had, they'll say 11, 12 different lineups last year, and it didn't matter. Is there any simple solution in your mind, or are you as kind of confused about this as a lot of people?
Well, I think they have the players to do it, but it's
when you've got Todd McShay saying they have 3 possible first round.
Yeah, obviously,
but everyone else could be drafted.
I think it's a matter of confidence. They need to play a little better to get a little more confidence defensively. I think they had that last year, certainly at the end of last year. But it is tough to figure. I don't think anybody would have ever.
I think you can. I wrote a little bit about this last week. I think you could point to maybe moving too many guys in and out, maybe playing around with lineups a little bit too much. Mike Gilliard was doing a pretty good job in that Mike linebacker job. In order to play Herrera and Ogletree together, they moved Gilliard back. That means Herrera played a new position, kind of signal caller on defense. That's not completely explainable for the last game or two, but it's, in my mind, it was kind of symptomatic of what Grantham is trying to do on defense this year, and maybe being a little bit too clever by half sometimes.
Here's my thoughts on that, and they like to play so many guys in so many different positions. That's a big thing. Yeah. You see more of that this year than what you had last year. One guy might play 2 spots, 3 spots, 4 spots, because they want versatility and they want to be able to move guys around. But at some point, you got to say, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Mm-hmm. And you wonder how much is in these guys' heads when they're out there playing. It's like, okay, well, I do this at this position, this at that position. It's a lot to deal with when you're playing as fast as these guys are. And, if you're looking for something, maybe that's it.
The pass rush is an issue. When Jarvis Jones isn't out there the other day, you're not getting any. Kwame got a sack the other day, but otherwise it's been Jarvis Jones or Jordan Jenkins or nobody. Cornelius Washington and Avery Jones have a half sack between them. And so other teams are basically looking at, if we stop Jarvis, we can do what we want in the passing game, at least in terms of having some time to be back there in the pocket.
Well, I think what that does more than anything else too is Georgia's not getting turnovers, and I think if you're able to pressure a team and force them into mistakes, then that's big. And right now that's not happening.
Let's go to the offense. The run game was quiet again against Kentucky. Everything was quiet against South Carolina, but obviously the pass game picked up against Kentucky. We don't need to talk about Aaron Murray. I'm not going to sit here and do the whole Aaron Murray in big games kind of thing, because he's either going to play well or he's not. The run game, though, to me, that's key. They're not going to be able to sit there and throw for however many yards they want to against Florida like they did against Kentucky. They got to get that going again. Mike Bobo, several times when people like me went to him and said, "What's the deal with the run game?" He was rather kind of defensive about it, saying there's nothing wrong with it. The run game is fine. What's your take on that?
I think South Carolina was a different game than everyone else.
Yeah.
Is my opinion on that. I think looking back, and I wrote this from watching the first half of the Kentucky game, the offensive line didn't play as bad as I thought they did when I saw it live. There were holes to run, and they had some decent runs. They just never broke a long one, and I think what you see is in the yardage totals, that's the difference between breaking a long one, which they were doing the first few games. Kentucky was able to crowd the line of scrimmage. I think they went into that saying, we're going to try to do what South Carolina did, not let Murray get comfortable, pressure the quarterback, and control things up front. I think Kentucky wasn't good enough to do that in the secondary. Really, that was the only way they were going to try to stop Georgia, because they couldn't cover him straight up, and I think they knew it. So Murray had enough time to throw the ball. I mean, he was sacked a couple times, but he was really able to do what he wanted. And I think the offense played pretty well. I think if you needed to run the ball more, I think they probably could have if they kept doing it and tried to wear him down. But I mean, you
can't say it. The offense had one bad game this year, and that's it. And everyone had a bad game in that one.
I agree. I think they played well in every other game.
Let's transition to Florida, and we've basically been talking about Florida the whole time, because it's in terms of, is Georgia going to be able to turn it on this week? It was kind of funny how the line started at 3.5, and I was myself surprised, and then it quickly moved up to 6. And a lot of Georgia fans would tell you that if they didn't want to bet against their team, they would bet on Florida still there.
I think probably should go a little higher.
Yeah, you're talking about momentum in terms of Florida having it and Georgia not, and Florida also has the revenge factor can be overrated, but Georgia beat these guys last year, so the vast majority of players on Florida's teams remember that, so they're not going to be overconfident in any way coming in. So that's another kind of intangible that's working against Georgia here. But I don't know, maybe we're overinflating Florida some ways. Maybe we're kind of tamping down Georgia. I don't know. How much of a chance do you see Georgia having in this one?
I think a lot of things are going to have to happen. I think they're going to have to find a way to move the ball offensively against Florida, when very few teams have this year. I think
got to run the ball. Got to run the ball this week. Got to stop the run.
I think the Carolina-Florida game, to me, that it was an odd game, because if you go look at the stats, neither team had 200 yards. It was kind of a strange game.
It was to South Carolina what the Georgia game was to South Carolina, as in it just
got out of hand. But I just think that I'm not buying Florida's offense completely yet. I know Georgia's defense has had issues, but they are extremely athletic, and I think they can make plays out there. But you have to get turnovers. You have to make plays that change the game. That's what Georgia did not do against Kentucky. Mm-hmm. If they had a couple turnovers, that's an entirely different game. Against South Carolina, Carolina was able to get a big early turnover. You have got to do that. Did that against Florida last year, and it was one of the big reasons of winning the game. And I think Georgia's got a chance, because I think physically they should be able to stand up toe-to-toe with Florida. But, we would have said that against South Carolina, and they weren't able to do it.
Last year, Georgia was better than Florida, and they beat them. They had to come back, but they were better. In the end, that was a case of the better team coming out ahead. 2 years ago, there was the pinball effect, and Georgia probably needs that one. It needs for it to go that way, but emerge with the win this time. Then last year, kind of just lining up and being toe-to-toe. Like you said, they need some turnovers. They need a break on special teams. Maybe they're due for that this week. I'm not saying Georgia isn't better than Florida. I'm just saying entering this game, Florida looks like the prohibitive favorite.
I think what would have discouraged me more about Georgia going into the Kentucky game is that was an opportunity for Georgia to come out angry and make a point and really, come out and play very aggressively and fly around and just be a different kind of team and show people, okay, South Carolina, that was the exception. They didn't do that. Kentucky came out the very first drive of the game, ran it right at them. And I think offensively Georgia played pretty well, but defensively they have got to get that back. They have got to play more aggressive. They've got to bring the fight to people. And you know, this is the kind of game where you cannot lay back on your heels and fall down 21-0, or else it's going to happen again what happened in Columbia.
Let's wrap up here by just talking about Georgia from the standpoint. Here's one. I hate the whole, when fans ask you what's the mindset of Georgia. We thought they had a good mindset entering South Carolina, and then when the game started, or even like a little bit before the game, you just got this bad feeling that it was a raucous atmosphere for the Gamecocks. They had it, and Georgia was just wasn't ready for it. This one, everyone knows what the atmosphere is like in Jacksonville. In the end, does Georgia's kind of not panicking mindset set forth by even keel mindset set forth by Richt, does that help them in that they haven't jumped off the bus, they haven't jumped off the rails after South Carolina, everyone questioning them, or do they need to light a fire? Does Mark Richt need to go start, castrating cows?
Well, I think the 2007 game is a good example of when the team ran out in the field and celebrated after the first touchdown. Georgia went on to win. I think they were coming off a pretty poor performance coming into that game, and that team was had not had as good a run as this year's team has to this point. And maybe something like that wouldn't hurt. Yeah, I don't think they're going to do that, but I think I don't know. They need something.
Everybody seems the feeling predominant in Georgia land and nationally is that Florida should win this game. So we'll see. Maybe things start to roll back around by Thursday or Friday, but it's not a pretty picture at the moment. But maybe that's it. Maybe the worm turns a little bit this week. You never know.
Yeah, we'll see.
All right. We'll be back Monday to dissect what went right or went wrong for Georgia.